We're talking about a word, extreme. And there's a coffee shop near our house in Tempe that is called the Extreme Bean. Maybe you've heard of it. I'm not sure why they call it the Extreme Bean. Maybe it's because they thought that was just a catchy name. Or maybe it's because they serve an extreme variety of coffees. Well, I went on their website, and it seems their mission statement says, "We intend to help you avoid sleep by making incredible coffee so you can do the things you want with your life." I love that. So maybe that's what they mean by extreme, that when you drink their coffee, you will become extremely wired and extremely wide awake so that you can be extremely productive. Do you think that's maybe what they meant? Maybe. Well, when you hear the word extreme, what comes to mind? Do you think of something exciting? Do you think of something dangerous or risky? When I hear the word extreme, I usually associate it with a sport or an activity, and it's usually a sport or an activity that I would never be caught dead doing. Like extreme rock climbing. Those of you who know Stephen Govette, one of his daughters is an extreme rock climber. Oh my gosh. Or extreme snowboarding. Not that I really have a desire to do any of those things, but you attach the word extreme to the front of it, and that makes me want to run away really fast in the opposite direction. But the word extreme can also have other meanings, like going to great or exaggerated lengths, like being on an extreme diet. Or it's the place where one might fall on the political spectrum, either being to the extreme right or left of center. Anytime we add the word extreme to an idea or an activity, it ratchets that idea or activity up a notch. And for some of us, when we add the word extreme to an idea or an activity, it makes us a little nervous. It might even make us afraid. Such is also the case with the word extremism. It provokes a heightened sense of unease because for some of us it implies that one believes in or supports ideas that are far from what most would consider reasonable or correct. That's one of the definitions of extremism. And when we add the word religious in front of the word extremism, that conjures up a whole another level of angst. Because although there is not a single definition for the term extremism, or rather religious extremism, the websites that I found that were willing to define it agreed that it describes a faith-based action that includes religious movements and beliefs that are likely to cause harm. Or, as Vernon Schubel, professor of religious studies at Kenyon College in Ohio, once wrote, "Unfortunately, the term religious extremist is generally used not to celebrate those who take their faith to the extreme by standing up for the powerless and the downtrodden and proclaiming love and hope over fear and division. It is instead used to refer to the most puritanical, misogynistic, homophobic, violent, and intolerant expressions of religious piety." Clearly, religious extremism is something about which we all must be concerned. And as true followers of Christ, it's something that we must work against. Because what I've read is that for the most part, those targeted by the religious extremists are also those who promote religious tolerance, multiculturalism, and equality of all people. In other words, the kind of people who most closely emulate the lives and teachings of Jesus, the prophets, the Buddha, and yes, even the Prophet Muhammad. Rather than trying to engage in conversation, religious extremists express their intolerance through horrible acts of oppression and violent intimidation, trying to get people to join their ranks. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when most of us hear the words religious extremism, generally what comes to mind is Islamic terrorism. Because terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS have all associated themselves with the Islamic faith. And yes, these groups are destructive and even deadly. But they also do not represent the core of Islam. They rely on a distorted, radically fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. But more to the point, Islam is not the only religion that has been hijacked by religious extremists. Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity all have their own brands of religious extremists. And they are all just as dangerous to humanity as those identified as being associated with Islam. For example, within Judaism, there are several extremist groups, in spite of the fact that mainstream Judaism speaks out regularly against such behavior. For the most part, modern Jewish terrorist incidents are related to the struggle to control the land that holds religious significance to Jews from around the world. In addition, the ultra-conservative Orthodox sect called the Haredim aggressively promotes their beliefs, their ultra-conservative beliefs, through oppressive and increasingly violent acts that are especially troubling to Jews who are more moderate in their beliefs and their interpretations of the faith. Hinduism, which historically has been more inclusive than toward other faiths, is also seeing an increase in extremist groups, promoting a radical Hindu theology. Over the last few decades, a revival in India has mobilized some Hindus toward extremist behavior, as Hindu nationalists perpetrate violence against missionaries from other faiths, which results in religious minorities, especially Christians and Muslims, becoming targets of violent attacks. And Buddhism, perhaps the religion that is best known for its calming presence among world religions, has historically experienced violence in the face of arguments over doctrine and methods. Most recently, Buddhist extremism has posed a growing threat to the stability of Southeastern Asia, with Buddhist monks leading campaigns against Muslims and other minority religious groups. In countries like Thailand and Myanmar, nationalist monks promote violence as being in line with Buddhist principles, in spite of the calls from Buddhist leaders such as Thich Nhat Hanh and even the Dalai Lama, who condemn the violence and make passionate pleas for peace. And lest we think that our own faith is immune, Christian extremism has been present since shortly after Jesus' death. From ancient persecutions to the Crusades, to anti-Semitism and the rise of groups like the KKK, radical fundamentalist Christians have committed terrible atrocities in the name of Christianity. Some trace these sentiments to the beginning of the Christian movement, during which a lack of religious tolerance that began with Christianity's inception. And to the extent that Christians have historically insisted that their way is the only true way, they have leaned toward extremism. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that all people who have a conservative theology are extremists. Quite to the contrary. But those that have taken it to a radical perspective, those are the ones that are of concern. Now, to be clear, today, a majority of Christians are more moderate than ever before. But that doesn't mean that extremist tendencies no longer exist. What's more, today's brand of Christian extremism is focused on intolerance rather than theological differences, driven by the extreme and sometimes radical interpretations of Scripture. Christian extremists have become strong campaigners against LGBTQI rights, birth control, abortion rights, science education, and gender equality. All battles that have emboldened them to commit violent acts and atrocities against those they consider their enemies. Now, I have to ask the question, and I think you know the answer. Do these extremist groups accurately reflect their faiths? No. Most Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and people of other faith traditions strongly criticize and condemn religious extremist behavior. Our faiths all teach us to love one another, to welcome the stranger, and to be compassionate toward those who are needy. Our faiths profess a theology of love, not a theology of hate. And yet, it appears that theology of hate is winning because religious extremism is on the rise. So, as thoughtful Christians on all ends of the spectrum, how should we respond to religious extremism in a world where extremist behavior is growing? Well, there are some who would say that we should respond to violence with violence. But Jesus tells us, and history confirms, that confronting violence with violence seldom, if ever, works. So what should we do instead? Well, John W. Moorhead from the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy offered 3 responses for those who are seeking a better way. First, he writes, we must find ways to promote peace. Ask ourselves that age-old question, what would Jesus do in response to religious violence? We know that Jesus taught his disciples to love their enemies, to be peacemakers, and to turn the other cheek. But, Professor Moorhead goes on, this doesn't mean that Christians have no right to self-defense, or that we should be the world's doormats. We do need to stand up for ourselves, but we need to do so in a way that promotes Christ's love and peace. And then that will be a move that has radical implications for us as followers of Christ. Second, Moorhead says, we must learn more about religions. We are a nation of religious illiterates, he writes in his article. And he validates that with the results of a 2010 Pew Forum survey on religious and public life. In this survey, 3,400 Americans were asked 32 questions having to do with the major world religions, including their own. And the results were less than stellar. In fact, the group that had the most correct answers, they were the atheists and the agnostics. People who either don't believe or don't know what to believe. Go figure. Our ignorance, not only about our own faith tradition, but about other world religions, has tragic implications on how we view and relate to each other and how we stand on public policy issues. If, as Christians, we will love our neighbors, we must be informed about their beliefs and practices. As people of faith, we are obligated to know about other religions and to encourage our nation's leaders to recognize the importance of faith-based diplomacy. And finally, Moorhead suggests we need to do a better job of building interfaith relationships. Because when we add a human face to an issue, or in this case, a different faith tradition, it just might change the way we feel about that person and the religion they represent. And it also just might change the way they feel about us and their perception of Christianity. Maybe. Now, I'll admit this might be a difficult proposition for some of us, but it can be done. We can build relationships with those who are not Christian while still keeping our own Christian convictions. And when we do that, we show them that we love them and we care about them, whether they embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ or not. By building interfaith relationships, we build bridges instead of walls. We come to an understanding that we are not enemies, that we are all people of faith. If we extend the hand of friendship to our Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist brothers and sisters, as well as our Christian brothers and sisters with whom we disagree, over time, our perceptions of each other just might be transformed from enemies to friends, or at least to trusted rivals. In other words, we are called as people of Christ to heed the words of the Apostle Paul. Bless those who harass you. Bless and don't curse them. Be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who are weeping. Consider everyone as your equal. Don't think that you're better than anyone else. Don't pay back evil with evil deeds. Instead, be respectful of what they believe to be good. Live at peace with all people. Do not seek revenge. Leave judgment up to the Lord. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For when you do, you'll surprise them with your goodness. Erica calls that killing them with kindness. And most of all, don't let evil get the best of you. Instead, get the best of evil by always doing good. May God add blessing to the hearing of these words. And all of God's people said, Amen.